If you want to be more effective in your work and in your life, and you'd like to have more confidence that you're meeting your intentions, this is where it begins. Welcome to Do Busy Right, helping you organize your information and manage your attention so that they work for you, not against you. We educate you and encourage you by discussing ways to be more effective, not more exhausted. Let's do busy right. Hi there. In this episode, I'm going to talk to you about the history of personal information management, and we're going to view that through what is a particular technology lens. This is an ancient technology, maybe one of the oldest technologies that's still in widespread use today. Of course, I'm talking about paper. We're going to talk about paper as a means of capturing information, recording information, and also making information permanent. And we're going to talk a good bit about ways paper may have changed people's perspective of information, and certainly their recording of information, and thus changed personal information management as a human activity. We'll have a couple of takeaways. One is human beings have been trying to manage personal information for a long time. That means that we can be a little less anxious about the fact that we have information that we have to manage. It's not a new phenomenon. We have technologies and social structures that are in place to help us, and not everything needs to be reinvented from scratch. Some things that worked can be reused or modified. We'll glean wisdom from these previous efforts to manage the information that the world presents to us and always has presented to us. The second, we'll develop and assess some tactics that are going to be useful to us as we try to get on top of our management of personal information. There are also some mindsets that we're going to pull in and help us understand this. I want to give a shout out to the Art of Manliness website. That's artofmanliness.com. I've been listening to Brett McKay there for many years now. He's published well over 1,000 episodes. He's very thoughtful on the topics of being a good person, particularly oriented towards men. His guest on this particular episode was Roland Allen. And Roland was there to talk about his new book, The Notebook. And that's a history of the notebook. This book is one of a genre of books that I've been interested in for years about personal information management and historical views of information. There are other examples I'll call on today. One is Hamlet's Blackberry, written by William Powers and published in 2010. That one's about various technologies that have come into play in history. I'll also refer to The Information by James Glick, G-L-E-I-C-K, published in 2011. Now, it talks about the history of our human understanding of information. You may know that information, while a fascinating topic on its own, is one that's not as clear as we might think or wish it was. When we talk about information and the information age, we don't really have a deep fundamental grasp of what information is and how it presents itself to us. And we won't get into that here, but these are some sources for this post. If you're interested in this kind of material on a broader scope, other topics beyond personal information management, the Art of Manliness website is often useful. You may want to check out Roland Allen and his book. Again, that's The Notebook. When we talk about the management of personal information, we can go way back. I considered starting with cave paintings, but decided that maybe that was too far back for one podcast episode. For a long time, people have been thinking about how to manage information, for lack of a better term, how to manage knowledge. Now, knowledge and information are so closely linked that it's hard to get a piece of paper in between them. But people have been talking about this forever, this management of information and knowledge. For example, I give you Plato. In one of the writings by Aristotle, Plato's pupil, Plato is discussing the usefulness of writing as a technology. Now, Plato was quite skeptical of this whole notion of putting things down in a permanent record. His argument had two basic points. One is that if we're using writing, our facility for mentally dealing with concepts would atrophy because we're recording them out. He was particularly concerned about our ability to remember information as we became dependent on externally recorded information. The second complaint was if we render an idea into a permanent form, it's immediately dead. That is, the writing down and the permanency of an idea really, in his mind, turned it into a fossil. And it might have some usability, but certainly it didn't have the flexibility that he thought our ideas need. Now, I find it really interesting that he used that particular argument because now we view it as just the opposite. We want information to be factual, permanent, unalterable, and in that way, we feel comfortable calling it true. So it's really interesting that he had this approach to the notion of knowledge and or information. Despite Plato's objections, writing still became a very prominent tool in the ancient world, including in Greece. In Greece, they wrote on scrolls, and as I understand it, these were expensive and fairly hard to use materials. Parchment, for example, is animal skin, like very, very thin leather. Has a nice permanency to it, but it's heavy and awkward. It was stretched out to make it flat and scraped of the hair and more fibrous pieces. You wouldn't use ink. What they used was more like paint on the parchment sheets. Another material that they used was papyrus, and it was, on the other hand, smashed reeds. And these were fibrous in one direction, a long, thin fiber. And so it would be made of multiple layers of fibers crossing over each other to give it some durability. Even so, it wasn't terribly durable, particularly subject to dampness, and it would fall apart if it got too wet. So these are challenging technologies to use for recording, but we were using them. They were very expensive and they were somewhat permanent. And so that limited their usefulness as a technology in certain ways. So to fill the gap around the 1300s, there begins to appear this notion of what was called table books. These are wax-based note-taking things. And then the mental image I have of it is, those picture frames that are hinged and fold together with the pictures facing each other. I think a table book was like that with wax where the pictures would be. And then you could close it to protect it a little bit. But then you'd open it and you'd have a sharp stick or some sort of stylus that you engraved the wax, so to speak, for legible writing. And this was a widely used technology for recording the day-to-day stuff. Now, it was reusable in a certain sense, and we'll get into that a little bit later. But it also allowed people to put it in their pocket or in their satchel and carry it around. And if they needed to record something, if somebody said something interesting or they met a new person and wanted to make a note, or maybe they transacted in some way they wanted to record, then they could scratch it down on their tablets and have a record of it and not have to rely on memory. And that's really interesting because it goes back to what Plato was talking about. We don't have to rely on memory anymore. Now, this whole business of writing, which of course has been around for millennia, gives us an alternative to relying on memory and relying on the spoken word to transmit information. And that allowed new and interesting things to happen in terms of the spread of knowledge. Now, the wax tablets were reusable, and I don't know exactly what they did to get the old scrapings rubbed out. Maybe there's a little warming thing involved so that the wax would melt. But in any event, we nowadays talk about reusable media, and the wax was certainly reusable. And even papyrus, I think, could be scraped, and maybe parchment as well, to get the old stuff off and clean it so you could put new stuff on. But the easier reusability was one of the great features of the wax table books. Now, there's this interesting thing about reusability when it comes to information. So let's be clear. You put it there so that you could recall it, so you could remember it. And presumably some of this stuff needed to be remembered for a fairly long time, like days, as compared to, minutes or hours. The trick is if you can't do anything with the information that's on this reusable media, then you can't reuse it. And thus the device is not reusable. Another example of this, if you've been in the corporate sector very long, you have seen a whiteboard full of writing with a big note that says, do not erase. Well, as long as everybody obeys that note, that board is really not reusable. And one of its primary features is basically hamstrung. Now, by analogy, with the wax tablets, presumably there would have been another longer term storage mechanism that you could move the information to before you erased it and got it ready for more recording. What's in my mind is that people took these books home in the evenings and transferred some of the information into a longer term archive, presumably made of some other writing material. And then they would rub out their wax tablet and it would be ready for the next day. The interesting point here when we talk about reusable media, it's not just can the media be erased and re-recorded. It's what are we going to do with the information that the medium held before we erase it? So that's a point there that indicates it was most likely a two-stage process in some sense. Now, this two-stage process idea will come back later as we look into this technology. But for now, advance forward a few hundred years, and paper that we would recognize became commercially available, commercially viable. Paper had existed in China, and it came through apparently the Middle East, kind of through Spain and up into Europe. And then the Europeans started learning how to manufacture paper in roughly the 1100s, the 1300s, in that time frame. Now, we talked a lot about reusability, and we should notice, first of all, that paper was not really reusable. Ink on paper stains the paper down to the middle of the paper. And that's what makes it hard to erase as compared to pencil lead. So paper was not reusable so much as it was disposable in an inexpensive sense. And that's something of a different thing. Now, disposable is not exactly the right word either. But unlike wax tablets, if you filled up a piece of paper, you could just put the full one in a box and get a clean one out. It was inexpensive in that sense. Now, the wax tablets, of course, would have been totally unwieldy and too expensive for this usage. But paper, much less expensive than parchment or papyrus, would have been user-friendly in this way. So this notion of having to transcribe off of a reusable medium, when paper shows up, that notion kind of goes away a little bit. And so it was no longer technically necessary to move it off the medium that it was recorded on, like it was with the wax tablets. And this notion will become more interesting later because people transcribe the information anyway. And we'll talk about what that means and derive some thoughts from that. So here we are, we've got paper. It's disposable in an inexpensive sense. It's not precious to us. I was particularly struck by the fact that we had paper for several hundred years before we had a printing press. So for these hundreds of years, paper was used almost exclusively for handwriting. Now, you could buy a bound collection of sheets of paper, and that was called a notebook. And this is also hundreds of years before printing. Now, paper, of course, could be and was bound both before and after use. So you could buy a book of blank sheets, or you could take a set of loose used sheets and have them bound together. And so this whole binding process is another technology that may have changed the way we use paper. But this whole notion of we've got these books and this paper that's blank and intended for individuals to record information as compared to authors and publishers producing information. Now, as an aside, I will say I don't think there's a huge difference between a pocket notebook and a pocket piece of paper. And this is evidenced by the fact that I don't buy notebooks for daily use. I buy copy paper and fold it up, stick it in my pocket. Now, other people like the notion of a bound journal, and probably for usability reasons. But I really don't like bound journals for this daily recording process. I think they're overly expensive, and I think they pose other challenges to us as users. But so here we are in the 1400s or whenever with paper. We have expanded our capability to gather information. Certainly, the tablets gave us opportunities, and prior to tablets, we had other opportunities, other devices. Maybe there was slate and chalk and some of these other things. But the tablet book really kind of stands out as an intentionally reusable technology. And then over time, we get over to paper, and it's just so much more usable for these purposes. More portable, less expensive, disposable in a sense, and permanent in a certain way. So paper affords different practices in information keeping. Now, back to this idea of books that are not printed, they're blank. I would suggest that to our modern mind, I think we assume that a book is that which has been printed and published. But there's a period of time when all books were handwritten. Now, there might have been a few that were from woodcuts or something like that, but commercially viable printing didn't come around until the printing press in the late 1400s. So what we modern folks recognize as a printed book would have been later, but there were still books. They just were not printed. So initially, books were intended to be handwritten or perhaps hand copied. They were created with a pen, of course, as compared to a movable type or a typewriter. So from this, I gather that the idea that an individual could create a book was a much more approachable notion than maybe we modern thinkers have been accustomed to. Now, I'll just speak for myself here, but when I think about creating a book, I think about writing out a manuscript or typing out a manuscript and delivering that manuscript to a publisher who then creates the book. As an example, I have a home printer and I could print out a bunch of sheets, but that to me is not creating a book. So in my mind, I need a publisher and a manuscript to create a book. Of course, it's also interesting that we've entered an age of self-publishing and publish on demand, where the publishing technology has made books cheap enough that you can really publish an edition of 10 or 20, a small number of copies of a book. And you can do this for actually a reasonably practical amount of money. Maybe $20 a copy would be a reasonable estimate. So say you want to create a picture book on your home computer and upload it as a PDF, send it to a printer, and get copies made for all your family members. So maybe 15 copies. So this exercise might cost you $200 or $300. A $20 Christmas gift for a family member, certainly not ridiculous. And so it's interesting that we now have this capability. But the point is the idea of a book as a individually created versus a commercially published thing. This notion that a book is something that's written out, and the notion of, oh, I can write one too, is a lot closer to the common mind then than it is now. It's also interesting to think about how books got produced via hand copying. So apparently various techniques were used to do this. Now, I'm most familiar with the copying process for making new copies of the Old Testament in the Hebrew tradition. And I won't get into it, but they had pretty advanced techniques for quality control because, of course, this is the Word of God, and they wanted to be careful to not introduce mistakes. And so the quality control was solid there. But the process was still somebody standing in front of the room reading, and a bunch of people sitting at desks, each writing out a new copy of the book from what they heard. Now, if you've got this mental image in your mind, somebody in the front of the room reading or talking, everybody else sitting quietly, scribbling furiously, then what comes to mind but a modern school classroom? And that's pretty close to what's going on. And we'll talk more about the use of notebooks in education here in a minute. But I find that to be an interesting parallel between, handwritten copies of books and the modern educational system. Another innovation that happens at this point is we begin to see a thing that's called a commonplace book. A commonplace book was a self-created repository of information that the individual author found interesting and worth recording. It's not exactly a diary. Perhaps a scrapbook is a little bit closer. It certainly wasn't an authored instance of a book, at least in the sense that an author sits down and writes out a book as a singular, discrete thing. This was more writing by, say, accretion. And in that sense, it was similar to a diary or a scrapbook, but it was very much about practical information and thoughts and factual things, and about things that the individual had learned or needed to learn. So we'll revisit the idea of a commonplace book when we get to education, but just this notion that people would take these books and write into them. They wouldn't have wanted to do it trivially. It would have been quite obvious that the use of a bound journal as a sequential autobiographical diary kind of thing would not be a terribly useful way to organize information for long-term storage. It would need to be organized differently so that it could be better accessible in the long term. In addition, they would have recognized that some things that need to be recorded don't need to be recorded for a long time. And so in my mind, it's very likely that people would have had two notebooks, a pocket notebook that they carried with them to record this transient information, and then also perhaps a commonplace book that they kept at their desk or in their office, into which they would transcribe some subset of the information that they had captured all that day. And so this notion of one to record and one to use as an archive, and the fact that they're two different things, I find to be fascinating. I'll also note that printed books and handwritten books both existed at the same time. So it's not like as soon as printing started happening, people said, oh, well, there's no sense in writing these commonplace books. So the new technology didn't immediately supplant the old. Now, I would guess that the printed book had some more authority. Perhaps if you had a choice between a published book on a subject and your neighbor's commonplace book on the same subject, maybe you would prefer the published book. But the interesting part is that they coexisted. And this means that the old technology still had value. The old handwritten commonplace book still had value. So now here we are at printed books. One of the earliest printed books, of course, was the Gutenberg Bible. And we all have some sense of the impact of that on the world. But another early form of published book was an almanac. And this is a nonfiction book that was really useful and would have in some ways attempted to replace the commonplace book as an authoritative published book of wisdom or knowledge or common sense. Similar topics probably would have been covered in an almanac as in a commonplace book. So now we're beginning to see, as I alluded to before, this more authoritative, broader reach of a printed published book. And the very human idea, if somebody's going to go to the trouble to set up and print multiple copies of a book, then at least the printer/publisher would have thought that book to be important and presumably commercially viable to people. Another information management piece is the speed of typeset print allowed the publication of newspapers. And newspapers were really quite immediate and I'll say ephemeral. Newspapers contained a lot of, oh, this just happened yesterday. And books really couldn't do that except in a metaphorical sense. So all of these things are happening at the same time. And the point to take away here is that we're managing different kinds of information in multiple different ways. Now back to the almanac. It's a book that contains common sense, proverbial kind of information about seasons and planting cycles, dates, historical weather events, and other historical events, maybe recipes or cures for ailments. And I think that we're familiar with, say, Poor Richard's Almanac, published by Ben Franklin, and perhaps you have had family members who made use of a farmer's almanac, some of those kinds of books. I will say probably the peak of this general information book was the printed encyclopedia. And this was at its heyday when I was in high school and college. And it was a bound, printed, lovely, published collection of some, ideally, significant percentage of human knowledge. And so the first encyclopedias became available in the 1800s, but the handwritten books still persisted, perhaps even as long as into the early 1900s as the commonplace book. Now, what does that mean? Well, I think that the commonplace book was supplanted by our move to a more formal and mostly compulsory education system in the West. Now, we're certainly familiar with the use of notebooks in education. After all, every student at some point in their educational career has been told to buy 5 spiral notebooks, a 3-ring binder, and 250 sheets of hole punch rule paper. These were the materials that they would use to create these notebooks. And this is interesting, if nothing else, as a derivation of the ways that we recorded personal information prior to the formal educational process. This creation of notebooks existed before formal compulsory education and after. Education in many ways hasn't changed much in 300 years in terms of the lecture. So imagine somebody knows this stuff, is telling it to a bunch of people who don't know it, and those people are trying various techniques to try to incorporate this knowledge into their own use, often furiously scribbling notes. Further, the etymology of the word lecture has to do with learning from books. Lecture is not derived from a word for speaking. So this sense of reading out loud from a text in a lecture And certainly, as we mentioned, this is the way hand copied books were made to be sold. So, with these ideas floating around, it's really not hard to envision a medieval education as consisting of creating your book of education. So, your teachers would have said, okay, get a notebook and bring it and sit in this class and write out these things about math. And then sit in that class and write out these things about language or whatever the subjects are. And I find that really interesting that students perhaps were creating their own book of knowledge. Now, we'll revisit this visual later in terms of both the commonplace book and the educational notebook. Back to this notion of formal education and compulsory education in the West, we immediately think of textbooks, which are like encyclopedias, published books about the knowledge, but the knowledge that a student needs, along with some pedagogy to help the student internalize that knowledge. Now, in a textbook, we see this overlap, this inheritance of technologies. Now, once textbooks start appearing, it's easy to see that, well, I don't need to write out a book. I'm given or I can buy a book that teaches someone how to do X, Y, and Z. And I certainly think textbook publishers would have at least a little bit of a vision that a highly motivated student could learn a subject simply from their textbook and wouldn't need a teacher or lecturer in order to learn the material. And this is really interesting because in some sense, and I'm not being sarcastic or blaming, but in some sense, education has become the accumulation and understanding of textbooks. It's become this notion of we're going to give you this textbook and we want you to be able to tell us what's in the textbook from memory. So that's how you pass the test. And you pass tests, you get a degree. Yes, you're going to, for lack of a better term, regurgitate the information that we all understand that's in this textbook. But that's a pretty recent notion of what education is about. And textbooks happened in the early 1800s or so when they first started being used. But with that in mind, it's easy to envision a student from 500 years ago had some bound print pages, went from lecture to lecture to collect the information in their education/commonplace book. It would become a practice book for the skill set they learned. Maybe somebody's learning to be an engineer, how to build bridges or something like that. And when they went to do it as their work, they would have this reference book that they themselves had created under the hands of masters, and they could refer to it as they went around building bridges. This type of book exists throughout the use of paper in our history. So it could even have been outside of the formal liberal arts education system. It could have slid over into the guilds and the trades, which is where practical information was disseminated. So if you wanted to learn to be a blacksmith, you didn't go to college or university to do that, of course. You became a tradesperson, an apprentice, and you were taught these things by a master. And the information, the techniques and information on how to do it lived in the guilds and was tightly controlled by them. But let's say you were an apprentice pharmacist. Maybe you would write down the recipes for cures in your commonplace book. In fact, and interestingly enough, the RX, the abbreviation for prescription, my understanding is that that's shorthand for a spelling of the word recipe. And so in some sense, a prescription is a recipe for a cure. So you can imagine these pharmacy students taking notes on how to mix the powders in such a way that it would be effective for a certain purpose, and then taking that book with them as they practice pharmacy. So for something like 600 or 800 years, people had been collecting knowledge and information in books written by their own hand. As we mentioned, it may have fallen out a little in the face of notebooks, in the face of textbooks, that is. And for the last 20 or 30 years, much of that has probably moved to the computer world and to keyboards instead of writing longhand. But even in the business world today, booksellers do a great business in bound blank books. And in some circles in the business world, it's an indication of sophistication for you to carry a bound blank book around with you during the day. And you take your meeting notes and such there. So this bound paper book, blank book technology is a thread throughout different sorts of informational endeavors that we've engaged in throughout history. Well, now we're thinking about this whole notion of the creation of a book as a goal itself and as a reasonable personal information management technique. Well, if so, then the question becomes, how do we apply modern technology to do this? I think that many people, as I alluded to, have moved away from paper towards electronic records, some partially, some completely, some, of course, not at all. There is a set of people who really, quite frankly, are beginning to lose the habit of using a writing instrument. And they're more keyboard oriented, more mobile phone oriented, and more oriented towards using electronic media as compared to physical media. Now, I use a pen and paper for much of my capture. So there are multiple different camps. Now, as we think about this and how we record the information, previously we looked at the notion of having two books. So we had the notion of a pocket book, a day book, and a commonplace book. The relationship between these two things was the movement of selected, curated information from the pocketbook over into the commonplace book. So how would that work? Well, one thing is when I teach people attention compass, we talk about two workflows. One is capture and another is processing. So capture is recording information so that we don't have to use our memory to do it. And then processing becomes a workflow of sense making around the information that we've captured. And that maps pretty cleanly to this two book visual that we had a minute ago. In this view, the act of processing would have been the act of taking and curating information from the day book into the commonplace book. And this is a technique that, as we said, perhaps goes back many years. Certainly, we would have had hints of it with the wax tablet. Because with the wax tablet, as we said, if that information was going to have any permanence at all, and if the tablet was going to have any use as reusable, then the information had to be moved. Now, the question is that a feature or a bug? So what would have happened is we would have had to process the information to re-handle it and rethink about it. In modern day, a lot of people who work on brain science will tell you that re-handling information is really good for learning. That the more different times you handle a piece of information, the more seamlessly and easily it's going to settle into your skull, where then it becomes useful as knowledge. Certainly, people use modern tech at a minimum for the pocketbook, the day book. And I think where modern people really differ dramatically in their usage is I think most people directly use the day book as permanent storage. Now, if this is true, then we need to question how in-depth is the curation step? How thoughtful was it? If we're skipping that step, we need to realize that it would have been valuable and useful as a summation or a deepening of knowledge about the information that we recorded. As an example, it's one thing to say, well, in your diary, our first frost last year was on October 30th. That's one event, that's fine, maybe it's helpful. But then establishing a pattern would require recording the first frost year after year. And then taking that pattern and saying, hey, expect the first frost the last week of October where we live. So whatever that has to do with farming, get it done before the last week of October. And then that becomes this useful piece of information as compared to just trivia. And that abstract understanding happens as we collect more information and as we consider information over and over again over time. Of course, there are ways that we can use modern tech for this process. I certainly think the notion of the day book being a mobile phone centric thing, I think that's useful. Personally, I don't use the mobile phone for that. I use it some for that. But as I've said, I typically have a piece of copy paper in my pocket and a pen, and I'll make handwritten notes. And I find that to be more convenient and more flexible. You know, you can doodle and draw arrows and things on a piece of paper, and that's very attractive to me. And it's also really difficult to do on a mobile device, at least for me. So, of course, there are other technologies. At present, the Remarkable tablet has some press. Styluses, I'm sorry, styli, I don't know for sure, of various types are available, Apple Pen. So you can write on your devices, but then in my mind, what's the advantage of that over a piece of paper? Well, okay, it's automatically recorded. Well, fine. You can record a piece of paper trivially. It's not a problem. But with the technology, you got a lot of extra expense, a lot of fragility, and at best, some sort of parity with a piece of paper. So that may be just a little bit of a controversial opinion on my part. But using mobile technology, at least to some degree, for the ubiquitous capture of information, I think is really an interesting usage because it's theoretically possible to record everything your computer does. I presume this technology is also available on mobile. There are several pieces of software that will literally take a picture of your screen every 10 seconds and put them together as a movie. So you can go back and in 12 minutes watch a movie of what your computer did for an entire 8-hour day. Now, the jury is still out, but I can see some hints of the usefulness of such a recording. But the point is that we're near to being able to capture everything that we observe or experience. You know, if you include an audio recording with a snapshot of your computer screen, then at least it would be powerful, if not highly useful. But that's another post on the ubiquitous capture, and perhaps I'll do that after a few episodes. So back to this two-step notion, this capturing and then processing notion. Talked about using mobile for the day book. Now, in the modern world, the permanence of a computer stored record argues in favor of computer storage as the long-term permanent record, as well as the convenience of the mobile device being an argument for the collection of the day book. So combine these two things and the one record exists for everything. Of course, before portability, there was good reason to not want to record things on a computer because you couldn't take a computer with you. But now the mobile technology is here. And we can refer to our information on that as well as capture. I do this from time to time and teach it in the attention compass training. So that whole idea of having two different places, a capture place, a day book, and a commonplace book versus one smeared out thing is something that I think needs more study. And which one is better? One is much more convenient because you skip the curation step. But that curation step, in a lot of ways, is what makes the information more valued to us more quickly. So, something to think about and consider and study. Now, when we get back to this history of book creation as a human activity, one consideration is that people have been wrestling with the information capture problem for a long, long time. Okay. When we think about the overall movement of what we've been talking about for the last little while, people have been dealing with this for a long, long time. And I was previously unaware of that. I knew that communication technology had changed over time and dramatically changed the way we communicate, but I didn't consider the fact that technology was at play to record personal information. And really, I thought of the personal information management task as a recent task. Now, of course, I know that it's not. So the point of that is that we've got a lot more history, a lot more human experimentation that has been done, and we can reference that and glean knowledge from it about how to do this effectively. It's also heartening to me to recognize that people have been dealing with this problem of information capture for a long, long time. And the problem of information capture and a lot of information didn't kill them, and it didn't destroy society. Okay. Now, we're talking here about personal information management technology, and I think in contrast to global telecom technology, there's some arguments about what technology may kill society. But that's another post as well. Another interesting thing that came to me in this research was the fact that going back a long, long way, our ancestors lived these complicated lives. So it wasn't just farming your plot and eating your vegetables and dealing with your animals. There's commerce and trade, having to record and make your own receipts of, hey, I bought this fabric from Johnson and expected in 2 months. So I need to have the money and be ready to come pick it up. This information has always been available to human people. And the complexity of that information led to the idea that they wanted to keep records of people and places and things. Their world was complex enough that they couldn't store it in their brains. We know that history. Now, some of the record keeping turned into financial stuff, and that turned into what we now think of as accounting and business management, money management things. So I think there's a case to be made for utilizing these technologies to create our own commonplace book, even perhaps in an educational world where textbooks are readily available, but certainly in professional learning where textbooks are much less available. Another interesting point is we're currently experiencing huge price inflation on textbooks. And to me, that's really troubling. And it might be incentive for us to create our own commonplace books in the educational process, or perhaps incorporating commonplace books into some homeschool. Of course, as I mentioned, after we exit formal education, if we continue to learn, then a commonplace book would be a useful idea about a purpose for learning, is to create this commonplace book. And who knows, it might even be something that's worth passing down to future generations. So in summary, this has been a lot more of a thought piece than a practical piece. And I hope it's provoked some thinking for you. So we've spent several minutes looking at history to derive some lessons. And some of the big ones were personal information management is not a new thing. It's been going on for centuries at various levels of technology. Also, there's some techniques from that and some mindsets. So particularly this two-book method and the notion of the commonplace book that may still be useful to us, but we've just forgotten about them. So, just thinking about the goal of a commonplace book and a potential example of how it might be useful. On a personal note, I'm a student of the Bible as constructed in the Old and New Testaments. And I've long thought that the notes that I've made through various studies might be of interest at some point to my kids or grandkids. Hey, what did dad or grandpa, depending on which offspring, think about this aspect of our faith? Or what did he think about this part of the Bible? And now I'm thinking I have the material for a commonplace book on those studies that I can then leave in case somebody later is interested in knowing what I thought. And I think that's a legacy kind of a notion. So in our last few minute or so together, I'll preview the next episode. In that episode, I'll be considering the relationship between information and learning. And as we can see, this capture of information that we've talked about in this episode is probably at least a precursor to learning. So I think that's going to be an interesting exploration. So I hope you'll plan to listen to that as well. So I'll leave it there for now. This is Larry Tribble, Ph.D. Thanks for taking some time to improve your task and information management on the Do Busy Right podcast. The show is dedicated to helping you think about how to get better at working. And we do this by improving your attention and your focus. I believe that your work is not just about your job, but about all the tasks that you do to turn yourself, your environment, and your relationships into what you want them to be. What we're really talking about here is the underpinnings of becoming who you want to be. The primary way I help people is through coaching the Attention Compass process. Attention Compass is 4 workflows and a tool set that support our information, task, and attention management. I help people with big goals to build habits that put them in a position to achieve. We do this by eliminating wasted time and wasted attention. If you'd like to know more, you can find me on LinkedIn or go to dobusyright.com for more information. Have a good week, more effective and less exhausted. Do busy right.